There's a quiet kind of power that never announces itself, the kind that moves not with crowns and trumpets, but with signatures on paper, with land-changing hands, with the slow redrawing of who controls what behind the gilded walls. And in the space of a single year, that quiet power has shifted toward one man, Prince William, in a way that has unsettled the most senior corners of the British monarchy. He now sits at the head of a private empire worth more than £1 billion, a sprawling estate older than the British Parliament itself, and the decisions he is making with it are unlike anything a future king has done before. To some inside the palace, it looks like vision. To others, it looks like the beginning of an entirely new order, one in which the old guard, the world that King Charles and Queen Camilla represent, is being gently but unmistakably left behind. And the deeper you look into what William now owns, what he intends to do with it, and who stands to lose influence as he reshapes it, the more you begin to understand why so many royal watchers are describing this moment not as a transfer of property, but as the first real flexing of muscle by a king-in-waiting who has decided he will not rule the way his father did. To understand the scale of what William commands, you have to go back nearly 700 years to the year 1337, when King Edward III carved out a special block of land and wealth and tied it forever to the heir of the throne. It was called the Duchy of Cornwall, and its purpose was simple and shrewd. The future monarch would never have to beg Parliament for an allowance, would never be financially dependent on anyone, because the duchy would generate an income of its own, year after year, century after century. For nearly 70 years, that estate belonged to a young Prince Charles, who poured himself into it, who built organic farms and model villages and a brand of biscuits, who treated the land as an extension of his own philosophy. And then, in September of 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral and Charles became king, the duchy passed in an instant to his eldest son. William did not campaign for it. He did not negotiate for it. The moment his father became sovereign, William became the Duke of Cornwall, and with that single change in title, more than 52,000 hectares of British land, hundreds of staff, a portfolio of farms and rivers and coastline and city property, and an estate valued at over £1 billion, all became his to oversee. It is a staggering inheritance, and yet for the first 2 years, William said remarkably little about it. He was learning it, walking it, studying its accounts, deciding what kind of landlord and what kind of steward he wanted to be. And then, slowly, the signs began to appear that he did not intend to simply inherit the machine and keep it running as it always had. He began to speak in a different language from the one his father used. He talked about doing things differently. He talked, in his own words, about embracing change for good. And those phrases, vague as they sounded at first, turned out to be the soft edge of something far sharper. Because what William had quietly decided to do with the Duchy of Cornwall would break with centuries of how royal land had been treated, and it would send a tremor through the part of the family that had always assumed the future would look much like the past. The decision, when it finally surfaced, was reported first in the Times, and it landed with the weight of something genuinely historic. William had resolved that the Duchy of Cornwall would sell off as much as 20% of its property over the coming decade. 20%. 1/5 of an estate that had been held intact, guarded, passed down unbroken for almost 700 years, was going to be released, sold, converted into something else. To anyone who understood the traditions of the British monarchy, this was not a minor administrative adjustment. This was a prince taking a centuries-old inheritance, an inheritance designed to be preserved exactly as it was and handed to the next heir intact, and deciding instead that he would reshape it according to his own conscience. Constitutional experts who study the monarchy for a living called it a very significant amount, a major reprofiling, the kind of move that would leave the duchy looking dramatically different 10 years from now than it had looked for the entire span of its existence. And the money involved was extraordinary. Estimates suggested the sale of that land could raise something in the region of £670 million, and William had made clear that he did not intend to simply pocket the proceeds or fold them into private wealth. He spoke instead of investing £500 million into local communities, into the very areas the duchy touched. The plan, laid out in the estate's own impact report, included building 2,500 new homes, 900 of them affordable, the kind of housing that ordinary families on the Isles of Scilly and across the West Country had been priced out of for years. There was money earmarked for environmental restoration, for peatland recovery, for the regrowth of ancient Atlantic rainforest, for farms transitioning to net zero emissions, for projects tackling homelessness in towns like Newquay. William was not just selling land. He was, in effect, announcing a philosophy, declaring that the purpose of royal wealth in the 21st century was not to sit untouched as a monument to dynasty, but to be put to work, to be spent down, to be turned outward toward the public. Royal historians grasped immediately what they were watching. One described it as one of the most significant changes ever seen in terms of the royal family turning over its personal assets for public use, and he noted something that should not be missed, that this set a precedent. Once an heir to the throne demonstrates that the family's private holdings can be converted, sold, redirected toward the public good, the question hangs in the heir over every other royal estate, every other castle and acre and private fortune, the family still guards. And that is precisely the part that begins to touch the world of King Charles and Queen Camilla, because the monarchy is not one estate but many, and the lines between what belongs to the institution, what belongs to the office of the sovereign, and what belongs personally to individual members of the family are some of the most jealously protected secrets in British public life. Consider what Charles himself holds. When he became king, he did not only inherit the throne and its ceremonial palaces, he inherited his mother's truly private estates, the ones that belonged to her not as queen, but as a woman, as an individual, properties that were hers to leave to whomever she wished. Balmoral, the vast Highland retreat in Scotland where Queen Elizabeth spent every summer and where she ultimately died, more than 50,000 acres of mountains and rivers and forest, became Charles' private property, managed now through trustees, kept in the family as it has been since Prince Albert bought it for Queen Victoria back in 1852. And Sandringham, the Norfolk estate where the royals gather every Christmas, where the family walks to church each December the 25th in full view of the cameras, that too passed to Charles, 20,000 acres of farmland and woodland and the great house at its heart. These are not crown properties. They cannot be claimed by the state or handed to the next monarch automatically. They are personal, and the king controls them absolutely. And the question of who will one day inherit them, and what condition they will be in, and whether they will still exist in their current form, is the kind of question that quietly shapes the balance of power inside the family. And it is worth lingering on just how personal these places are, because they are not abstractions on a balance sheet. Balmoral is where Queen Elizabeth spent the happiest weeks of every year, where she rode her horses and walked her dogs and felt more herself than anywhere else on earth. And it is where she chose to spend her final days. Sandringham is where the family gathers each Christmas, where generations of royal children have run across the same lawns, where the late Queen broadcast her first televised Christmas message, and where her own father died in his sleep. These estates carry memory in a way no crown palace ever could, because they were never about the office of the monarch. They were about the family, the private human family behind the institution, and whoever controls them controls something far more intimate than land. They control the gathering places, the inheritance of memory, the physical heart of what the royals are when the cameras are off and the ceremony is over. To imagine those places being treated the way William is now treating the duchy, opened, reshaped, perhaps one day sold in part, is to imagine the family's most sacred private spaces becoming subject to the same cold logic of reform, and that possibility is enough to make the most settled members of the household uneasy. Because here is the tension that William's bold decision with the duchy has exposed. He has shown himself willing to break tradition, willing to sell, willing to reshape, willing to treat even the most sacred royal inheritance as something that can and should be changed. And that willingness sends a signal up and down the entire family. It tells everyone watching that when William's time comes, when he is the one holding Balmoral and Sandringham and the Duchy of Lancaster, and the full weight of the monarchy's private fortune, he will not feel bound by the way things have always been done. He will not treat the past as untouchable. And for those whose comfort, whose status, whose very place within the royal world depends on the old arrangements remaining exactly as they are, that is a deeply unsettling prospect. Nowhere has this new assertiveness from William been clearer, and nowhere has it cut closer to the family's nerve than in the extraordinary fall of Prince Andrew. For years, the king's younger brother had clung to his titles, his honors, and above all, to Royal Lodge, the grand 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate that he had occupied under a long lease, refusing to leave even as scandal after scandal made his presence a liability to the entire institution. Charles, by many accounts, agonized over what to do about his brother, torn between family loyalty and the damage Andrew was inflicting on the monarchy's reputation. And it was here, in the resolution of that long and painful standoff, that William's hand became visible. Reports indicated that the Prince of Wales had a significant role in the decision to strip Andrew of his royal titles and to remove him from his residence. Andrew was to vacate Royal Lodge. The man who had defied the family for years, who had seemed immovable, was finally being moved, and the pressure that finally dislodged him was understood to have come, at least in part, from the next generation, from William, who had reportedly made plain that the scandal could not be allowed to fester into his reign. That single episode tells you something essential about the shift underway. The old approach, the instinct of Charles and the generation around him, had always been to manage, to soften, to avoid the rupture, to follow the ancient royal creed of never complain and never explain. Camilla herself, watching the Andrew saga unfold, was described as embracing exactly that mantra, attending church, saying nothing, weathering the storm with the practiced composure of someone who had spent decades learning to survive scrutiny. That is the old way. Endure, deflect, preserve the surface at all costs. William's way is different. William is the one prepared to act, to insist on consequences, to force the difficult decision rather than let it drift. And as he demonstrates that willingness again and again, with Andrew, with the duchy, with his entire posture toward how the family should operate, the people whose influence rests on the old way of doing things find themselves watching a future they did not design and cannot fully control. This is where the figure of Queen Camilla becomes so fascinating and so misunderstood. Born Camilla Rosemary Shand, she has lived one of the most improbable lives in modern royal history. For decades, she was the woman the public would not forgive, the third person in a famous marriage, the name spoken with bitterness in the years after Princess Diana's death. She endured an extraordinary campaign of public hostility, rebuilt her image inch by painful inch, and eventually achieved what once seemed impossible, standing crowned beside Charles at Westminster Abbey as queen. Her entire ascent was built on patience, on endurance, on the slow erosion of resistance through sheer persistence, and the careful management of appearances. She knows better than almost anyone alive how fragile a royal position can be, how quickly the ground can shift beneath someone the institution decides it no longer needs to protect. And she has spent her years as queen consolidating, securing her place, building relationships, ensuring that the world she and Charles inhabit remains stable and recognizable. But Camilla's world is, by its very nature, tied to Charles. Her status, her residences, her influence, all of it flows from her marriage to the king. She has her own private property, Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, the home she bought after her first marriage ended and kept as a personal retreat, a place that is entirely hers, so cherished that Charles reportedly purchased a neighboring estate simply to protect it, to stop the land next door from being turned into a wedding venue, disturbing her sanctuary. But Ray Mill House, lovely as it is a private home, not an empire. Camilla does not command a billion-pound duchy. She does not hold the keys to Balmoral or Sandringham in her own right. Her power is the power of proximity, the influence of a consort, and such power has a natural horizon. It lasts as long as the reign lasts. And William, whether he intends it or not, represents the end of that horizon. He represents the moment somewhere in the future when the Charles era closes and a new one begins, an era in which the center of gravity moves entirely to William and his wife Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Every assertive move William makes now, every demonstration that he will reshape the institution on his own terms, is also a reminder that the world Camilla has so carefully built around herself is, by definition, temporary. The homes, the arrangements, the comfortable assumptions of the present reign all exist within a clock that is always running. This is not cruelty, and it is not a plot. It is simply the brutal arithmetic of monarchy, where every heir's rise is, quietly, a measure of how much time the current order is left. And when that heir turns out to be someone willing to sell off a fifth of a 700-year-old estate, someone willing to push his own uncle out of his home, someone openly determined to do things differently, the arithmetic feels less like a distant abstraction and more like a countdown that has already begun. There are other tremors running through the family in this same period that sharpen the sense of an old order under strain. There have been reports of friends of Catherine, the Princess of Wales, making candid remarks that left some senior royals, and Camilla in particular, feeling sidelined, as if the spotlight and the narrative were drifting decisively toward the younger couple. There have been whispers of Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, contemplating an explosive memoir, the kind of tell-all the family dreads, a potential time bomb of revelations that the institution would have to scramble to contain. There has been the slow, awkward saga of where the king and queen will even live, with Buckingham Palace undergoing a refurbishment costing hundreds of millions of pounds, and reports that Charles and Camilla may never actually move into it as their main home at all. Each of these stories, taken on its own, is a minor royal headline. Taken together, they paint a picture of a generation in transition, of an older guard managing decline and damage and discomfort, while the younger generation, led by William, moves with a confidence and a decisiveness that makes the contrast impossible to ignore. There is something almost poetic in the fact that it is land that has become the battleground of this quiet succession. Land has always been the truest measure of power in Britain, older than money, older than titles, the thing that kings fought wars over and dynasties were built upon. To hold land is to hold permanence, to hold a piece of the country itself, and for centuries the royal. Family has measured its own continuity in acres handed down unbroken. So when the heir to the throne looks at the oldest and most symbolic of those holdings and decides that a fifth of it should be sold, the message reverberates far beyond the financial. It says that even land, Even permanence itself is now negotiable in service of a larger purpose. And in a family whose entire identity rests on the idea of permanence, that is a profound and disquieting thing to hear. And at the heart of that contrast sits the Duchy of Cornwall, the billion-pound engine that William now controls, the clearest possible symbol of where the real future of the monarchy's power and wealth is heading. Because the duchy is not just land and money, it is a statement of values, and William has chosen to make it a statement that breaks sharply from the past, where the monarchy has long been criticized for treating its duchies as opaque commercial operations, vast money-making machines whose inner workings were shielded from public view. William is pushed in the opposite direction, releasing detailed impact reports, opening up the accounts, talking openly about distributable profits and environmental spending and the social mission of the estate. He has said, in plain terms, that he does not want to be a traditional landowner, that he wants the duchy to be more than that there is so much good it can do. He talks about prioritizing the things that will genuinely improve the lives of the people living on and around his land. It is the language of a reformer, of someone who has looked at the inheritance handed to him and decided that simply preserving it is not enough, that it must be justified, made useful, turned toward a purpose beyond the perpetuation of the dynasty itself. For an institution built on continuity, on the idea that the monarch is a living link in an unbroken chain stretching back 1,000 years, this is a quietly radical posture. Charles, for all his own interest in the environment and in organic farming, ultimately operated within the traditional frame, building and improving and stewarding the duchy, but always preserving it, always passing it on intact. William is signaling that he sees the inheritance differently, not as a sacred object to be guarded, but as a resource to be deployed. And once an heir thinks that way about the Duchy of Cornwall, the most protected income source in the entire monarchy, the obvious question becomes how he will think about everything else when the full weight of the crown finally rests on him. Will the private estates be opened further, sold further, redirected further? Will the comfortable assumptions of the present reign survive into the next? These are the questions that hang unspoken in the corridors of the palace, and they are the reason William's stewardship of the duchy is being watched not just as a financial story, but as a window into the entire future shape of the British monarchy. It is worth pausing on just how unusual it is for an heir to move this boldly while the reigning monarch is still very much on the throne. Charles is king. He is active, he is carrying out engagements, he and Camilla are touring the country and representing the nation abroad. By every constitutional measure, this is still firmly his reign. And yet, William is not waiting passively in the wings, as heirs have traditionally been expected to do. He is reshaping a billion-pound estate. He is influencing the family's most painful internal decisions. He is articulating a vision for the monarchy that is recognizably his own and recognizably different from his father's. There is a delicate balance in this, a careful choreography, because an heir who appears to be overshadowing or preempting the sitting monarch can create exactly the kind of tension and rivalry that the institution works so hard to avoid. The fact that William is moving as decisively as he is while Charles still reigns tells you that the transition of real influence is already well underway, that power within the family is flowing toward the next generation faster than the formal handover of the crown would suggest. And this is the deeper meaning behind all the talk of estates and ownership and who controls what. The story is not really about a single transfer of property. It is about the slow, inexorable passing of an era. The world that Charles built, the world that Camilla fought so hard to find her place within, is a world shaped by a particular generation, a particular set of values, a particular way of doing things, of enduring rather than acting, of preserving rather than reforming, of managing the surface and never explaining what lies beneath. William represents a different temperament entirely, more willing to confront, more willing to change, more willing to spend down the inheritance in pursuit of a purpose. As his control over the duchy demonstrates that temperament in action, the contours of the coming reign become visible, and they look strikingly different from the present one. None of this means open warfare within the family, and it would be a mistake to imagine slammed doors and shouted arguments behind the palace walls. The reality is subtler and, in its way, more profound. It is the reality of a family in which the future is becoming clearer by the month, in which the heir is no longer a distant figure waiting his turn, but an active force reshaping the institution in real time, and in which everyone whose position depends on the current arrangement of power must quietly reckon with what comes next. For Camilla, who has spent her entire royal life mastering the art of securing and holding her ground, the rise of a confident, reform-minded William is not a personal attack. It is something larger and more inescapable. The simple turning of the page, the arrival of a generation that will write the next chapter in its own hand, on its own terms, with its own priorities, and with a willingness to break with the past that her own generation never possessed. The land tells the story most clearly of all. For nearly 700 years, the Duchy of Cornwall passed from heir to heir essentially unchanged, a fixed point in a changing world, a piece of medieval machinery still humming away in the modern age. The fact that William has looked at that ancient, untouchable inheritance and decided to sell a fifth of it, to convert centuries of preserved wealth into homes and environmental projects and direct investment in ordinary communities, is perhaps the single most revealing act of his life so far. It tells you everything about the kind of king he intends to be, a king who measures the value of his inheritance not by how perfectly he preserves it, but by how much good he can make it do. And it tells you just as clearly that the comfortable certainties of the current reign, the world of Charles and Camilla, the world of endure and preserve and never explain, is drawing slowly toward its close, replaced now by something newer, sharper, and far less bound by the weight of tradition. That is why this moment matters so much more than the headlines about estates and ownership would suggest. Beneath the surface of a property decision lies a generational reckoning, a quiet contest between two visions of what the monarchy is for. One vision holds that the institution survives by preserving itself, by guarding its wealth and its privacy and its mystery, by enduring whatever storms come and revealing as little as possible. The other vision, William's vision, holds that the institution survives only by justifying itself, by opening up, by putting its wealth to visible public use, by demonstrating that it deserves the place it holds. As William reshapes the Duchy of Cornwall in the image of that second vision, he's not merely managing an estate. He is staking a claim about the future, and that claim, by its very nature, unsettles everyone who has built their world on the assumptions of the past. So when you hear that William has taken control of a billion-pound royal estate, that he is reshaping it in ways no heir has dared before, that his rise is sending tremors through the most senior corners of the family, understand that what you are really watching is the future arriving ahead of schedule. The crown has not yet changed heads. Charles still reigns. Camilla still stands beside him. The old order is still formally in place. But the center of gravity has already begun to shift. The next king is already shaping the world he will one day rule, and the land itself, that ancient, hard-won, jealously guarded Duchy of Cornwall, is being remade as the first and clearest proof of what his reign will mean. The page is turning. The era is ending. And the man holding the pen has made it unmistakably clear that he does not intend to write the same story his father did. Whatever comes next for the British monarchy, for Charles, for Camilla, and for the whole intricate web of power and tradition that holds them together, one thing is now beyond doubt. The future belongs to William, and William has decided that the future will not look like the past.